Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting in just a few moments. We'll let people trickle in here. Get started in just a few minutes. Thanks for coming today. Okay, so just a few housekeeping and updates from the COEH. For our upcoming webinars on Wednesday, August 21st, we have Dr. Cynthia Mejia and Mindy Shaws presenting on technology, health, and safety in the hospitality industry. On Wednesday, September 4th, Dr. Yvonne Yim will be presenting a webinar on the challenges in accessing rural healthcare in Hawaii. And lastly, September 18th, we have a webinar on engaging frontline workers to solve ergonomics problems with Dr. Devana Piljuk. For more, you can visit coeh at berkeley.edu/webinars. I'll put a link in the chat. I'd like to welcome everybody today. On behalf of education and research centers throughout the country, we are pleased to present the Industrial Hygiene webinar series. This collaborative effort on behalf of each ERC's continuing education program aspires to provide access to current research supported through NIOSH ERC programs. Thank you so much for joining us. Today's webinar, Work to Zero, Leveraging Safety Technology to Eliminate Workplace Injuries and Fatalities, is presented by Dr. Kate Crawford in partnership with the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health and the National Safety Council. A few housekeeping items first. You will be muted during this presentation. If you would like to ask a question, please enter it into the online Q&A box on the toolbar on Zoom. We will save time at the end of the presentation to address as many questions as possible. We'll also have the chat open. Feel free to use it to participate and join the conversation. We'll also be using it for a poll during the presentation today. This presentation is being recorded and will be made available on the Center for Occupational and Environmental Health YouTube page within 5 business days. Lastly, all participants who logged in with their registration email for the full live presentation today will receive an email tomorrow with a link to an evaluation form that will qualify participants for a certificate of completion worth 1 continuing education contact hour. Once the evaluation is completed, you'll be able to access and print your certificate. Now, we are pleased to welcome our presenter, Dr. Kate Crawford. Kate Crawford is the Senior Research Manager with Work to Zero at the National Safety Council. The National Safety Council is a mission-based organization working to eliminate the leading causes of preventable death and injury, focusing their efforts on the workplace and roadways. Kate has a MS in industrial hygiene and a PhD in occupational and environmental health from the University of Iowa, where she studied as a NIOSH ERC trainee with the Heartland Center. She worked as a postdoctoral research scholar for the Emerging Issues Program at the Great Plains Center for Agricultural Health, a NIOSH Agricultural Safety and Health Center. Kate's research with Work to Zero explores ways to integrate safety technology into the workplaces and develops resources to help employers implement safety technology solutions. I'll pass it over to you, Kate. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks, Will. I'm very happy to be here and to share some of the work that we've been doing over at Work to Zero. So I will get my screen shared. There we go. So today the presentation's leveraging safety technology to eliminate serious workplace injuries and fatalities. Just to start, I think I just wanted to give you kind of a rundown of what I'm going to talk about today. So give you a little bit of background on Work to Zero and what our program is, how we explore safety technology and workplace injuries, highlight some of the work that we've done, which also includes some tech case study highlights, which I'm hoping will help illustrate some of the things I'm going to be talking about. And then also wanted to go through a recent survey that we did and talk about some of our findings from that. And then we'll leave time at the end for some Q&A. I also wanted to make a note because I know there's probably going to be a lot of questions. I'm not going to share these slides, but all the really cool stuff from them and the images and the graphics and stuff and all the information I'm talking about today comes from the resources on our website at Work to Zero. So the address is up here, nsc.org/work-to-zero. Everything is free and available for download. So if there are things that you're interested in, I encourage you to take a look at that. And then certainly there's contact info at the end if you have any questions for me directly or need help finding anything. So a little bit of background, as Will mentioned, NSC is a nonprofit focusing on eliminating injuries both in the roadway and the workplace. I focus primarily in the workplace and preventing workplace injuries. And I think this group is probably not surprised that we know that there's a lot of work to do there. In 2022, there was over 5,000 fatal work injuries in the United States, which equates to a worker dying every 96 minutes. We're seeing an increase from the year before in 2021 and an increase from pre-pandemic levels in 2019. And really kind of over the past 25 years or so, we've seen some of the OSHA recordable injury rates drop and some of those non-fatal injuries drop, but really some of the fatality trends have remained relatively stagnant. And so we're really trying to look at ways to address those specifically. So that's where Work to Zero comes in. Work to Zero is a grant-funded initiative within the National Safety Council. It was started in 2019, funded by the McElhattan Foundation. And we're really focused on trying to understand how safety technology can be used to eliminate these workplace fatalities. I like starting my presentations with this image. It really shows that we've come a long way in our safety journey and how safety technology can be used to address some of these hazards that we see in the workplace. But we know that its implementation in the workplace is not widely adopted. In fact, sometimes we see a lot of these technologies in our personal lives and not in our workplaces. So if there's an opportunity to adopt safety technology, design out risks to workers, then that's something that we want to focus on and see if we can start making a dent in some of those fatal injury statistics that we keep seeing year after year. So what we do at Work to Zero is we look at how tech can be used. So how are early adopters using these technologies? What hazards are they addressing with them? What kind of lessons have they learned from how to implement them? And then we try to help kind of disseminate that information and help others as they're looking to adopt as well. So in 2019, when the initiative began, we had some fundamental research questions. And this is really kind of the basis for our initial work, which was the Safety Tech 2020 project, so mapping tech solutions. And so the first of those research questions, kind of the most fundamental, was what are the most hazardous situations with the greatest potential for fatalities? So really trying to understand the burden here. So NSC researchers reviewed BLS data, CFOI data, and started looking at those characteristic types. So things like worker activities, event exposures, primary and secondary sources, looking at all of that injury data to contextualize workplace fatalities within the hazardous situations that they were occurring. So not necessarily looking just at events or industries, but really trying to focus on situations that apply across industries and figuring out what those are and kind of categorizing those. And this is what we saw. Now, these are non-roadway fatalities, and that just comes from the fact that, as mentioned earlier, NSC has a group that is focused primarily on roadway injuries. So we kind of eliminated those, although I will say we know that continues to be one of the top causes of workplace injuries. But so what this is saying is that 23% of these fatal injuries were occurring at work at height situations. We also see workplace violence was high on the list, repair and maintenance tasks. So these were the things that workers were doing when they were killed on the job. So going back to these questions, we also wanted to know more details and understand contributing factors. So to supplement that BLS data, we were also interviewing EHS professionals from different industries, including construction, oil and gas, utilities, manufacturing. We wanted to talk to them to get more insight into what kind of risks they were seeing. With their hazardous situations that were identified, but then also the associated risks within their facilities. So this gave us an opportunity to identify kind of inherent situational risks. So we talked about that hazardous situation, which is work at height. Some of the situational risks that apply there would be falls to lower levels, or being struck by falling objects. And then we also wanted to know about systemic contributing factors. So what are things that can exacerbate risk within those hazardous situations if they're taking place? And the top three contributors in that category were lack of training, fatigue, and lack of workplace awareness. And we describe lack of workplace awareness as being unfamiliar with the job site or your surroundings, not paying attention to what's happening around you, things like that. The next big question was what technologies can then eliminate or mitigate those risks? So to really explore that, NSC partnered with Verdantix, which is a research and advisory firm. Their research coverage is dedicated to EHS technologies and innovation. We looked at more than 100 relevant technologies that were helpful in mitigating these situational and systemic risks that were identified. Technologies that were perceived as the most effective and of interest to those professionals that we were interviewing were selected to be examined further. And so this slide shows some of the kind of priority topic areas that we've been looking at based on that feedback. So digital gas monitors, which I know is certainly something this crowd is used to, drones, lone worker monitoring, extended reality technologies, a lot of different things that we were looking into. And then so to kind of pull all that together, I'll use work at height as an example here. That 2020 project worked to map those technology solutions to those hazardous situations, looked at how effective those professionals perceive them to be at addressing both those situational and systemic risks. So again, if work at height is that hazardous situation, we know that some of the situational risks are falling to lower levels, falling objects, systemic risks, worker behavioral failure, leadership failure, and then there's all these different technologies that were identified that could be used to address at least some of these risks and how those could be used. So I think let's take a moment to think about how we use these technologies. So industrial hygiene, that's the theme for this webinar series. What we always talk about, right, is anticipation, recognizing, evaluating, and controlling hazards. And we can start thinking about these safety technologies in the same way. So is there data that we can collect ahead of time that will help us anticipate an incident before it occurs? There are companies out there that are collecting and managing all their EHS data. Perhaps they're even utilizing some AI solutions to start kind of anticipating things before they happen. We can think about using technology like computer vision to recognize hazards. So this picture in the middle is from a pilot study we did where a group had trained cameras with some AI software to recognize when there were workers in loading bays, when airbags were deflated. So they were using it to recognize hazards, something that they could keep their eyes on all the time. And then evaluation, certainly we know there's tech to evaluate hazards, mentioned gas monitors, dosimeters, things like that, and how we're using those to really evaluate the hazards we're seeing in the workplace. And then, of course, there's the control element. So there's technology that we can use to control hazards too. And thinking back to like our hierarchy of controls and the different ways that we can do that. So starting at the top, eliminating hazards, The drones, I think, are a good example of how we can eliminate hazards if we're keeping someone's feet on the ground, right? If we're using them to do aerial inspections and we're not sending a worker up in the air to do that work, then they're not going to fall from height. If we can keep someone out of a confined space, then we're eliminating the need for them to go into those confined spaces. Substitution, certainly, I think with technology, we just talk about what type of tech we're using. Can we replace some of our manual equipment with pneumatic equipment? I know our MSD lab, we have a program that focuses on MSD injuries, and that's something that they recently did a case study on. Engineering controls, can we isolate people from hazards? So some of the tech that we've looked at, location geofencing, can we geofence areas? So if someone enters a certain area, can it shut off a system? You know, can we kind of improve that lockout tagout procedure to the point where we have automatic shutdowns, depending on when something is sensed coming into a certain area? Administrative controls, I think traditionally we talk a lot about training, but there are options to use technology to enhance our training. A lot of times we talk to companies who are using extended reality, so augmented reality or virtual reality, to help with their training opportunities. And then PPE, certainly we're seeing a lot of wearables. You know, are there things that we can put on workers to identify signs of heat stress? Can we put something on our lone workers so they have a panic button if they need one to alert someone right away if there's a problem? So a lot of different ways to use it. And I think let's try and use the chat and see if that works. So be very interested to know if you're using safety technology, and if you are, how you're using it. So maybe it's a yes, no, maybe you're thinking about it. Are you using it in any one of those particular areas? What's kind of coming in? Wearables, lone worker protection, yes. Some limited use. Looks like there's some interest in lone worker technology. Absolutely, that's something we've been recently looking into. I think we're seeing a lot of that. Drones for roof work, yep, great. Gas monitors, absolutely. Okay, very cool. Accelerometers, yep, thinking about it. That's awesome. It's always cool to hear about what people are using and how they're using it. So some really good examples in the chat. I appreciate you sharing those. So we'll go through, I'm going to just do a few kind of case study highlights to give you some more examples. So it's really neat to see that there's people using some of these in the chat. I think there might be some overlap, but I'll share some of these with you. I really like doing the case studies here at Work to Zero. It's a really cool opportunity for me to talk to these people who are innovating, they're using technology, and I'm going to do an overview and we'll talk kind of about what the tech is and the risk and some high level lessons learned. But really it's an opportunity for us to find out best practices. People tell us what didn't work when they tried to roll out a pilot, what they learned, you know, and we can kind of incorporate all that back in so we can continue to share best practices and learn from those. So here's one. The first one I'll talk about is a company that was using drones for boiler inspection. So already touched on drones a little bit based on the chat. It looks like there's some folks already using these. So these can be used for confined space entry, certainly work at height, as was mentioned in the chat, for the roof work. In this particular instance with these boiler inspections, this company had these massive boilers. So it's confined space, it's high heat, poor air quality, and there's some work at height concerns. So that was everything they were kind of looking at when they had workers going into the boilers to do these inspections, and they would have to shut them down and cool them and then send people in to do these inspections. So they started using drones instead that could go into these right into these boilers and take video and send this information back so they could get all this information and data. They were even able to take some samples, like metal samples from inside with these. And what the company had reported is they were looking at this in terms of kind of man hours and hazardous work, or can we impact safety through man hour exposures? And they calculated that over time, since they implemented this program, they prevented about 60,000 hours of high risk work. And they reported improved productivity. All of that led to huge savings for this company. And I think some of the other kind of important lessons learned here, in talking with this group, they talked about how they set up these regional drone task force teams. So they had workers that were using these at the pilot site kind of become their experts, and they became responsible for scaling up the use of the tech to other sites. So the people who were using them, the people who understand the work and the process the best, they found to be the best suited to go forward and train other employees and talk about that, which I thought was a really interesting kind of lesson learned. So another case study, this one was lone worker monitoring for alerts. So again, based on the chat, it looks like a lot of interest in that already, also a lot of use for this. So we know that there's a lot of risk associated with lone and isolated work. Sometimes that's workplace violence. Sometimes that's a delayed response time for injuries. And so some of these monitors, depending on what you have, some of it's enabling a two-way communication device. Sometimes it's a panic button, something that can report back to kind of the home base and let other people know what's going on. So the company we interviewed for this, it was an asset management company. So they had a lot of workers going to properties by themselves, sometimes large properties, certainly working alone. There were some issues, both with some potential workplace violence, and then also just being kind of out of communication with everybody. So if something happened, the workers reported that they were uneasy going into these situations. So they enabled these kind of panic buttons that also had these two-way communication. So someone could easily get hold of somebody back at the base, alert any kind of emergency response if necessary. And some of the feedback from there, it was really a lot of their impacts that they saw had the most to do with how the employees kind of felt about what they were doing and some psychological safety benefits that they saw. So increased trust with the employer because they felt that their concerns were being addressed. Also found that they were increasingly open to trying other technologies, and they started looking at other potential pilot opportunities because the workers had really kind of taken to these. Some of the other lessons learned that were shared was that importance of focusing on the employees as the end user and gathering their feedback on the impact of the tech, as well as their need for the tech, because it all started with kind of their concerns in the first place. And I think a really big one for this is prioritizing transparency and clearly communicating how data is used and not used. So a lot of the times the kind of pushback you might see with these lone worker monitoring technologies are, am I being tracked? How is this being used? You're getting GPS data. And so conversations about how to work with the employees, make sure everybody understands what's being collected, why it's being collected, why it's needed, what it's not being used for, were big lessons learned for this group. So some interesting things there. The next case study that I have today is computer vision for work at height. So computer vision is a mix of camera analytics and artificial intelligence. So this was a company that was having issues with some fall hazards in their loading bays. So they had trucks coming into these loading bays. And because of the way it was set up and how the workers were using them, they kind of couldn't use some typical fall protection, but they had these airbags that were used to cushion the area if there was a fall off these loading docks. But the issue is if they weren't staying inflated, then they obviously weren't doing their job. And so they looked at computer vision um, as a way to solve for this, kind of thinking back to like what their need was. And what they said was, we really just need to have eyes on this all the time. And so they had cameras in place. The computer vision kind of created an opportunity to build off of something they already had in place, and to train this machine to recognize these deflated airbags. So that was actually the picture that I showed earlier on. And so those cameras were trained to identify and alert when the airbags are deflated. If there's workers in there, if there's trucks in that area, it could notify the EHS team immediately. And since they deployed this, there's been no fall injuries. They haven't had any injuries in the loading bay. And I think an interesting lesson learned for this group was actually they started finding all these other applications that could really improve the return on investment for this technology. And some of those were even brought to their attention by their employees, who said, this has been great. We should also use it over here with these machinery, this machine. If it can tell when somebody's getting too close to it, can it shut off or alert someone or do something like that? So they've actually since been looking to expand how they're using the computer vision at their site to do more than just address these. Kind of some interesting lessons learned here, I think also tie back into what we just talked about with the lone worker monitoring, which is engaging your employees and being very clear and transparent about how that data is being used, and what it's being used for. Since this one, there was cameras already in place, but I think the initial concern that employees voiced were, what are you watching? How is that being used? Am I going to get in trouble? And I thought kind of a creative solution to this that this company shared with us is they set up the camera feed on a TV that they put in a break room, and it was just on all the time. So employees could see what the EHS team was seeing, and it just made them more comfortable with how it was being used and what they were looking at, and how that how it looked. So I thought that was interesting. And then the last case study that I brought for today is using augmented reality for confined space work. I thought this one was interesting. I mentioned just a little bit ago with the extended reality, a lot of the times for VR and AR, we talk to companies who use it for training, because it really, there's data to suggest that it is a great way to enhance training. People can kind of build this muscle memory for doing tasks without being in hazardous situations. This company was using the augmented reality for confined space, though. So this was a different application that I thought was interesting. And essentially what they had were electricians that were doing rewiring work in confined spaces while there were machinists working in other areas. And what they were seeing were slip, trip, and fall injuries, sometimes lacerations or head injuries when they were moving in and out of these spaces. And since the electricians were doing this kind of very particular wiring work, what they would do is they'd be in the confined space, they'd have to come back out, consult schematics and things, and then get back in and do it. So what they did is they were using augmented reality to overlay schematics in the panels where they were working. So they could get into the space. They were in there for a much shorter period of time because they could overlay the schematics as they were working, eliminated the need for them to leave. They didn't see any of those injuries that they were seeing before. They also said it really reduced fatigue. So their employees said, that fatigue wasn't as big of an issue going out and in and looking at these and kind of stressing about the work they were doing. Improved productivity, reduced job time. So they reported an increased rate of first-time pass quality from about 50% to over 97% when they started doing this. So it was really helping them actually do their work. Then another thing they mentioned was they could project safety messages and reminders through those headsets as well, which was helpful. Some of the lessons learned that they shared with us was the importance for developing cross-departmental policies and procedures. So length of use, cleaning the devices. I thought that was interesting. They also talked about the importance of kind of leveraging their pilot process with their provider to really create opportunities to correct unforeseen issues, and kind of really use that to test things out and tweak it before scaling that up. So some important lessons learned with that group as well. So all this research that I've been talking about, the reason that we collect all this information about best practices, how people are using it, is this is what we incorporate into our resources. We have called our kind of suite of resources the safety innovation journey. So it's really kind of the different steps along that path to consider if you're looking to implement technology. So understanding your risk, and then identifying the tech solutions that can be used to address that. So that's why we do so many of these kind of mapping projects, because a lot of times people know their risk. They're not even sure what technology would be best for it. I think I certainly, when I heard work at height, one of the last things I was thinking of was computer vision. But getting back into like, what's the actual issue, that became something that they were able to leverage successfully. Determining your readiness is kind of things that we learned in those case studies. So that cross-departmental policies, you know, who do you have to talk to? How do you engage with HR and management and your workers, of course, everybody along the way, and how's that, what you need to have in place to get ready for these technologies, making the business case, understanding the ROI, certainly what investment you're looking at. And then the roadmap kind of just steps to actual implementation. So how do you pilot a tech? How do you then scale a pilot up to full rollout if that's something that you're going to do? So that's how we organize all this information. So with that, kind of about halfway through, I'm going to switch over and talk about a recent survey that we did. The survey is a way for us to get a lot of information from these end users about what hazards they're seeing, what technologies they're using to control them, where they need help, and all that sort of stuff. So back to that initial research, after we did that major project, kind of the next project that Work to Zero did was a survey of employers and employees in high-risk industries. The goal being to really understand the awareness, attitudes, and use of tech within the different industries. And then using those top kind of hazardous situations, risks, technologies, everything we identified, we used the survey to collect data to understand, you know, what the most likely exposures were, what the main concerns were, and what could we understand about kind of trends in use. So we surveyed 500 employers and 1,000 employees. We did the first wave in April of 2020 through 7 different industries. And then we redeployed this in 2023, at the end of 2023. And so the results from that I'll talk about now. So minimal revisions were made to the survey between waves to ensure valid comparisons. We did make a couple revisions, including the addition of new risks. So thermal stress, that was something that wasn't included in the first one, but something we've certainly been seeing as a top concern and frequent exposure lately. So we added in some questions about that. Added in another concern specific to data privacy, as that was something that people were coming and asking about. And then technologies, lone worker monitoring and location geofencing were 2 new technologies that were in the 2023 survey. So the goals for this, again, identify workplace hazards that employers and employees perceive as likely exposures and contributors to injuries. What safety technology solutions are currently being used to address those hazards, the barriers and motivators to implementing safety technology, and then changes and trends since that 2020 survey. So we collected demographic data for both of these to ensure similar samples between waves. We did see a little bit of difference, but nothing too alarming. So no significant differences between waves for job role, ethnicity, gender, region, and company size. We did see a little bit of a difference in the breakdown of industry. And I'll talk about that when we get through some of our findings. And then with employers, no significant differences for most of those, but we did see some changes in size of company. So again, like I said, all of this is in resources and reports available on the website if you want to see these details. So I'm going to highlight some of the results, starting with likely exposures and contributors to injuries. So employees were asked how likely they are to be exposed to different hazardous situations in their jobs. And then similarly, employers were asked how likely their employees would be exposed to those situations. And across the board, the main thing we saw between waves in the last 3 years, perceptions of those exposures have just increased. Increases in employees reporting likely exposures were significant for most risks. So they're here in bold. And they were more similar to employer responses in this last wave than in wave 1, where we saw kind of a bigger gap between the two groups. The most notable differences between employer and employee perceptions were related to a lack of workplace awareness and work at heights, both of which employers perceived as more likely exposures than employees. Wanted to note that workplace violence is still perceived as the lowest exposure risk for both groups. However, the perceived likelihood of exposure has significantly increased since 2020, with at least 1/3 of both groups considering it a likely exposure now. And so thinking how we address these different risks, this visual just illustrates how the responses regarding the likelihood of exposure and the top contributors to injuries compare to each other. So this is just employer data. So again, asking how likely will your employees be exposed? That's on the y-axis. And then what were the situations and risks that contributed to injuries in the last year? That's on the x-axis. So if we start looking at this as a foursquare, we see in this top right-hand corner, these would be the ones that employers perceived as a high likelihood of exposure and a high contributor to injuries. So fatigue, far and away, kind of the top of the chart there. We also see thermal stress, heavy equipment operation, and work at height in this area. I do want to say, you've probably noticed this, but I just want to call it out. So this does not take into account severity of injury or concern over injury. So that's not to say that anything down here in low exposure and low injuries is not something we should be concerned about at all. It's just really kind of a way to look at how we might start understanding these risks and maybe look at how we're controlling them. And also maybe what should we be focusing on? So, are we making the most impact by looking at this top right area where we know that these exposures are occurring frequently? We also know they're resulting in injuries. There we go. And then also wanted to say, sorry about that. I just lost my place. So then looking over here in the top left, so let's just switch quadrants for a moment. So high exposure, low industries, that's where we're seeing repair and maintenance work. Does this mean we're controlling these risks really well? So does this mean high exposure people are doing this work all the time, but we're not seeing a lot of injuries? Is that because we're controlling well, or we've figured out how to do that safely? I think this bottom right quadrant, the low exposure, high injury quadrant, is kind of interesting. There could be a lot of things happening here. So training and lack of workplace awareness. And I think about how we're collecting these data and the potential limitation here. So what this is saying is, we don't often have lack of proper training. We don't often have lack of workplace awareness. But when it does, it results in injuries. Like those were top contributors. So is there some bias in not recognizing, like thinking the training and the workplace awareness is better than it actually is? think we have some other survey data that might help support that. Or is it just that, you know, we don't usually do it, but when we do have a failure in training, it absolutely has a kind of a terrible outcome. So again, just a way to start thinking about these risks and how we address them. And then so let's also talk about some of the concerns we saw. Concern over workplace violence is increasing. That's one of the biggest differences we saw between waves. Significant increases in employers' level of concern. So 66% up from 57%. Kind of interesting to note, I think, is despite 66% saying that they were very concerned about this, only 56% of employers were providing training on it. And then approximately 10% experienced workplace violence that caused an injury. So again, maybe not experiencing it, but very much concerned about it. And I will say, thinking back to some of the fatality data we talked about in the very beginning, we know that there's been notable increases in homicides in the workplace in the past year, up almost 10%. So more generally across industry, there were no significant difference in the concerns reported, but we did see employers in the construction industry reporting notably higher concern over workplace fatalities. So about 81% of employers said that they were really concerned about that, compared to other industry responses, which range from about 60 to 75%. Certainly, this may be due to the higher number of likely exposures and workplace risks, and the continually high fatality rates that we see within this occupational group. For transportation and warehousing, we had employers reporting notably higher concerns for employee illness, data privacy, workplace violence. Again, I think interesting to think about in terms about what we know about that industry, what we know about the impacts of the pandemic in transportation and warehousing, workplace violence, certainly. Agriculture reported higher concerns than other industries for lack of proper training and substance use. And then retail employers were most concerned with fatigue, lack of training, and technology automation. And then for the next part of the results, I'll talk a little bit about some of the technology use and the barriers to adoption that were reported. So I know there's a lot here. We'll take a second to kind of go through this. So we asked survey participants, we asked them to identify technologies that they believed were relevant to their organizations and their hazards. So we considered this kind of this applicability line along the top. So is this technology relevant to the hazards in your workplace? We also asked them if they were considering using these. And then finally, certainly asked them if they were using these technologies. So this first line along the top, this applicability line, that's saying, in the first column over here, 92% of employers said that risk management software was relevant to some kind of risk within their workplace. Similarly, the next line over, worker impairment detection, 92% of employers said that that was relevant to something they were concerned about in their workplace. This next line, the consideration line, 82% of employers said that they were considering using that risk management software. So yes, it's relevant. Yes, I'm considering using it. And then the bottom line is who's actually using it. So 38% were using it. So what I've tried to do here is just highlight some of the larger gaps that we've seen. So certainly this line, aggressive behavior detection, we see one of the largest gaps between employers saying it's relevant to their workplace, but they're not considering it. And then kind of the different gaps that we're seeing between consideration and use. So worker impairment detection, extended reality. So 66% of employers are considering both of those tech, but less than 20% are actually using it. And so I think this is interesting from our perspective, from a research perspective, is understanding what's really driving these gaps and figuring out, what are the barriers that are causing these gaps, and what resources can we create to kind of address these and narrow these gaps. I think and you know what? And I have this with lines, so I'm gonna put some lines on this graph, and I will say, we'll do one first. Okay, sorry, I apologize. I'm getting ahead of myself. But I'll do a comparison between waves first, so you can kind of see the differences in the trends that we're seeing. So between surveys, these darker colors, I'm hoping this shows up on the slide. The darker colors are the more recent 2023 data, and the lighter colors are the 2020 data. So again, this applicability line is up at the top, 2023 in the dark blue and the light blue. And I'm gonna add lines to this chart. This is for visualization only. So you can see that the tech is listed across that x-axis. So this is not a continuous variable. These aren't connected. But I think for the sake of just trying to get through this chart and showing this kind of big picture, I think it's easier with the lines. So apologies if it's offending anyone's sense of data and how we visualize it. But the reason I want to show this is because this is kind of the trend that we're seeing, is that over the past few years, more people have said, yeah, this tech is relevant to what I'm doing. I understand how this can be used. I'm seeing it used more often, or I'm hearing about it. More people are considering it. But what we're not seeing is a change in that use line. And so I kind of think of these two gaps here as kind of a knowledge barrier and an implementation barrier. So the knowledge barrier is understanding what tech's even out there, how it can be applied to what you're doing. And then the implementation one is how you go from considering to using. And so that's what we're really trying to dig into and address. So I'll ask again, if you want to throw stuff into the chat, just interested to know what your organization's biggest challenge to technology implementation is. Is it finding the right tech? Is it building the business case? The data privacy concern that we talked about, employee buy-in, and maybe there's something that's not even on this list. So if you've thought about that, please share that. Just interested in what the group has to say. Employee buy-in, yeah, I think that's a big one, certainly that we hear a lot about. Cost and privacy concerns, absolutely. Yeah. I'll let those keep coming in. Business case, cost, data privacy, absolutely. Reliability of the tech, I think that's a really important one. Budget, absolutely. This is great. Yeah, keep bringing those in. I'll keep going. I know we're coming up on time. I'll share with you some of the things that we saw. So this is what we were seeing in this survey. So purchase cost, that was certainly, we saw a lot of that in the chat, right? I mean, certainly technology, a lot of these safety technologies are a substantial investment. It's a substantial investment up front. There's also a lot of times maintenance costs, subscription costs, things like that. What we're seeing between waves, though, is that has really gone down, and actually across the board, the top barriers that we see reported, we're seeing a decrease in those who are saying that that's the barrier. So purchase costs, employee compliance, employee distrust and fear, those have gone down as well. I think that's really interesting. We kind of dug into the employee data, and we see a lot of employees that are more and more willing to try and do some of these. There was stuff in the chat about the data privacy, Big Brother. I saw that come up in there. I think one of the barriers that we saw employers reporting was concern over that data privacy, collecting personal information. I don't have a comparison for that one because, like I said, we added that in 2023. but about 49% of employers thought that that would violate employee privacy. And I just, interestingly, to me, there was a significantly lower number of employees who reported the same concern, about 10% less, so about 39% of employees said that they were worried about it. And I think that's interesting, that employees are kind of accepting some of these more, but it doesn't mean that as employers, we know how to handle that. And so I think there's a need there to figure out how to understand how to collect data, store data, manage data, secure data, because we're seeing employees are maybe less worried about it, but employers aren't ready to kind of handle that yet. And then I also wanted to throw this in here. So we also surveyed employees about barriers to more traditional safety equipment and personal protective equipment, as well as safety tech. And so the main obstacles for using PPE in the workplace is comfort. And again, I think to this group, this is not a list that you're going to be surprised about. We know these are barriers to PPE. We know this is like the pushback we hear when people aren't wearing it or don't want to wear it. And I put this in here just because I think that many of these barriers translate to safety tech as well, especially for wearable technologies, which we're seeing so much of right now. So vital signs monitors, the lone worker monitors, extended reality devices, exoskeletons, things like that. All of this still absolutely applies to those things as well. If it's not comfortable, if it interferes with work, obstructs your vision, if it doesn't fit, can't maintain it, not being trained properly on it, supply issues, ease of use, time to properly don and doff, those are going to continue to be barriers for technology as well. So just to kind of wrap up, I'll make a couple notes about future directions, and we'll try to get some time for some Q&A. Really kind of what we're focusing on, like I said, the goal of this program is really how do we make innovation accessible? And if we think about technology adoption as a journey, we have folks that are in that pre-contemplation stage. We have people in that preparation, consideration phase, and then that innovating phase. So back to my graphs with the relevant, considering, and use, we can also start thinking of it kind of in this way as well, and what do we see to move people along. And so we have seen shifts from 2020 along the spectrum. So, you know, more people are innovating, more people are considering and preparing. But what kind of work can we do to focus on these three different kind of audiences, these three different stages? And really at this pre-contemplation stage, these were folks who just need more information. They don't have enough resources. They're not ready. So getting them information about what technology can be used and how to use it. The considering preparation group, these kind of later adopters. So still looking for evidence of success. I think this is where those case studies really come into play. This group is always interested to know what other people are doing. I encourage you to share with others if you're using these things, how that went for you. If you're using them successfully, or if something didn't work for you, I think that's great too. We try to get case studies of like failed pilots. That's really kind of critical information, knowing where things went wrong and what could potentially be done differently. Practical tools for implementation, guidance documents, things like that. And then certainly this group that's already implementing, how are they maintaining that? You know, what kind of continuous improvement is taking place? How do we kind of share those best practices with others? So getting into, you know, what we're focusing on, like I said, the case studies, we do pilot studies. So we like to work with companies pre and post implementation to evaluate different technology. And then this kind of human-centered approach. I mean, I feel like I've hopefully highlighted it throughout, but really that employee engagement is such a critical piece. And how do we work with our end users, people on the front line, understanding both hazards and the controls and how best to use those and what we need to do to get those in place. So like I said, if you're interested in this information, if you want to look at any of the data or get more details about any of this stuff, the survey data is available on this report. The QR code should take you there. And then again, our website is nsc.org/work-to-zero. All of our resources are there, free for download. So the case studies that I've highlighted, you can go in and see details of those. The priority tech papers, the safety innovation journey, all those resources are there. And I also encourage you to get in touch with us if you have ideas or questions, or you want to partner on any kind of thing. We're always looking to expand our research and do more projects, and also hear about what needs to be done. So I encourage you to reach out. And with that, Will, I know we just have a few minutes, but I'm happy to take questions. And then certainly if there's any we don't get to, I'm happy to answer some offline.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate, for presenting on this. We do have a couple questions. I have one question about the case studies, and if in the case studies, the companies that you were studying are mostly larger or smaller employers. I think it brings up the question of like management bandwidth and intersects with a lot of these issues of implementation. So I wanted to ask about the size of the employers for the case studies.
That's such a great question. It's so relevant. And honestly, the ones I shared are a mix. Certainly, you're gonna quiz me on it. So the augmented reality, that is certainly a larger company. The computer vision company, I'd say small to medium size. They had 160 employees. The asset management, the lone worker, that was another smaller company. It really ranges. I think we did a case study with a construction company using drones, and they have 8 employees. And that was something, I think that's the smallest company that I've interviewed, but really interesting to hear about that, because that absolutely plays into this, that factors into it. One of the projects that we're looking into for this next kind of grant project that we have is translating things specifically for small businesses, because it's certainly a different set of barriers. Really trying to understand how to translate some of those resources and tools. So that was a long-winded answer to say we try to get a range. We do try to provide that information. We're hoping to get kind of more detailed in that going forward.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that question. I have another question about the lack of proper training. How would you define that? That is maybe outside of your purview, but somebody was wondering in these studies, is it the employees that are saying that they don't have proper training?
Yeah, that's another great question. I encourage you to look at the report for more detail, or reach out. We saw that coming up in a couple areas. So we asked both. We did see lack of training, especially when we asked employers about what was contributing to injuries, and we saw them saying, yes, it was lack of training in some cases. I will say, comparing the two groups, we did see a marked difference with employees reporting that they had less training than employers did. So employers, we saw a gap there where employers were like, no, we provide this training. This is when we provide it. And with employees, we were seeing just lower numbers of that. So really kind of an interesting disconnect there, which I think is worth addressing. Something else we're looking into. It's a great question.
Okay, we have one more question, and this is about the implementation of technology. We have Eddie Sanchez. He's asking, what have you witnessed to be some of the best approaches to getting technologies adopted from worker proposals? I'm wondering if those successful proposals should include cost versus saving projections, or potential grants/funding to fund the technology. The implementation barrier feels vast and tough to navigate, which is very true.
That's such a good question. We could do another webinar on that, honestly. And I will say, like, it's not a one size fits all. I think in a lot of ways it's very much specific to the company, to the resources available, to the employees, to the hazard. There's no one right answer for this. And I think a lot of the ways that we try to create the resources is to help people ask the right questions and understand that. And then that safety innovation journey, it's trying to come at this from all these different ways, because there's some cases where, yeah, if the biggest barrier is the ROI, we've seen companies be successful with getting help with pilot grants or looking into opportunities for that to kind of get a leg up over that. And then for others where that's not an issue, if it's employee buy-in, you have to come at it from a different angle. So it's a great question. It's a complicated answer, and it really, I think, depends on so much, and it can be very specific to each situation.
Well, here we are at time, and we've answered all the questions that we have, which is wonderful. I just want to say thank you so much, Kate, for coming today and presenting this really exciting research. And thanks everybody for coming. I put a link in the chat for future webinars. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.